I mean, oh, welcome in latest episode of that SEC podcast. I'm your host, Michael Bratton. I go by SEC Mike on Twitter. And that is, of course, Stephen Lassan, senior editor over at Athlon Sports. That's your cue to know it's an SEC After Dark. Stephen, how you doing, buddy?
Mike, I'm doing great. It's getting real, isn't it? Like, I've already seen teams practicing for week 0. There are teams in week 1 kicking off practice later this week. August is almost here. So once we start fall practice, you know it's here. It's almost football time. As much as I love the previews and predictions, it's almost time to see some actual games coming up.
Yep, and we've been seeing it all week, really. It started, I believe Missouri was the first one. Of course, probably Florida State, probably even earlier. But SEC, we don't care about no garbage ACC on this show.
Future
but,
SEC school, Mike?
Yeah, if they joined what we love, we've always loved them. You know what?
Right.
But yeah, press conferences, loving to see those. We've seen so many. So at some point this week, we're going to try to recap kind of the best of moments from a lot of these. But yeah, you're right. I mean, we're so close. Camps are opening up all across the SEC, all across the country. And Stephen and I, we're wired the same way. He hits me up on Sunday, with show topic ideas. And he said, what about biggest fall camp takeaways? I said, I was just writing you biggest fall camp questions for each SEC team. So that's what we're going to do on this episode of the show. Here's Cousin Shane. He says, I love this show. Yeah, because he didn't have to do any work. That's why he loves it. But, Stephen, again, fired up for fall camp. And why did you always want to talk the biggest questions for fall camp? Any thoughts on why this fired you up so much?
Absolutely. I think kind of as I was getting at in the intro there was when we start getting actual practice reports and I start seeing photos and videos from practice, I'm just ready to get to week 1. And we've kind of had the off season, the transfer portal's complete, rosters are set. We know the coaching staffs, all of the off season movement is done. And now once you get into the fall, all that's done. The rosters are complete. You have the most complete, kind of picture you're going to have of these teams. We've been talking about previews and predictions, and we'll still do that. But it's like it's real. Like fall practice is going on. We're going to be able to see some of these position battles, quarterbacks, the schemes, freshmen, transfers, how it all fits into place. So I'm just fired up to get to the season, and fall practice is like one sort of stepping stone there, and it gives us a little bit better idea of what's going to happen on the field this year.
Right. And again, so Stephen has not shown me his list. I've not shown Stephen mine. So we don't even know what we're going to be talking about here, but we are going to hit on all 16 SEC teams. Hit us with that donation if you want your team thrown to the top of the list. And Stephen, I've gotten a lot of comments saying, hey, why do you always start with Alabama? Why don't you do reverse order for some of the teams at the back end? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go reverse order because the season's nearly here. Stephen, I might as well change things up here. Let's do Vanderbilt. We never get any Vanderbilt donations, so maybe
Cousin Shane did one time.
Yeah, that's true. And he's in the chat. Give us some money, Cousin Shane. We'll change the subject. But let's go Vanderbilt, Stephen. What is and I told Stephen, don't limit yourself. It could be literally anything. Could be player. Could be coach. Could be anything. What is the biggest comment, question, concern, what have you about Vanderbilt as they enter fall camp?
Words that you probably will only hear on the voice of the SEC, and that is that SEC podcast, is that I am very interested in seeing what happens at Vanderbilt in fall practice. Not many people are probably going to talk about Vanderbilt, but I do think in a very broad sense, a lot of intrigue for this team for me because of how important of a season it is for Clark Lee. But I think the thing that interests me the most is the quarterbacks, and especially Diego Pavia. He's in an offense under coordinator Tim Beck that they had at New Mexico State last season. If you watch Diego Pavia at New Mexico State, I think he's a fun player, very chaotic. He's going to move around. He throws a lot on the run. How is this going to work out in the SEC? We're going to get the first look at that this fall. And not to mention Nate Johnson, the other quarterback that's transferring in from Utah, another guy that Vanderbilt could use with his mobility. So I am interested just to see how Vanderbilt is going to make this work. But if they're going to escape the cellar of the SEC, it really comes down to Diego Pavia, and by far my biggest area of interest in fall practice.
And Stephen, I got to hand it to you because you were the very first person that I heard that kind of referenced the hot seat with Clark Lee. And you're not a hot take guy, so anytime you give us a nugget like that, I always kind of it piques my interest. And I'm not saying that you're completely wrong or anything, because interestingly enough, at media days, a lot of people start mentioning Clark Lee. Could this be it for Clark Lee? I'll talk about my talking point for Vanderbilt in just a second, but I hate to be so negative right out the gate here. I mean, fall camp just starting, but what are the odds that that this is the final fall camp for Clark Lee there on the West End?
I think put him in that year two of kind of hot seat talk. Like, I think it's sort of getting warm. I think if you're Vanderbilt, and especially when you see that over under this season at 3, a brutal schedule in the new 16 team SEC, I think it's not necessarily just about wins. It's also about on-field progress. So I think just if Vanderbilt is just more competitive this season, I think you can sell that to get another season for Clark Lee. So I would say probably not. I'm not there yet on there will be a for sure coaching change, but I think it's probably inching closer to like 40% or so. And kind of the early game against Virginia Tech could be kind of telling to see where this goes.
And one thing, I don't know that this really applies to Vanderbilt, Stephen, but I think it's something to monitor moving forward. And really, for all these SEC programs that their coach may be on a hot seat, it's a lot of it's NIL. And why am I bringing that up? People get tired of hearing about it probably, but let's say Vanderbilt goes 3-9, what have you, and they don't win an SEC game. Again, Vanderbilt, it's maybe not fair to throw them into this conversation, but the NIL is not going to be, because there's no excitement with that program. If let's say Arkansas, I hope this doesn't happen. I love Sam Pittman, but if they go 4-8, let's say they bring Sam Pittman back, who is given to that Arkansas NIL? And the point being is, if you fire your coach, you can sell optimism, you can sell a new direction, and really, I think fans will buy into that and give money because they believe with new leadership, we can turn this ship around. I mean, do you think that is something that will have to be considered for a lot of these coaches that are on the hot seat?
100%. I think in this era of college football, especially with NILs and collectives, something new always sells. If you know the sure thing and the donations are drying up and it's hard to retain, it's also hard to land players from the transfer portal. If you go with something new, odds are the donations are probably going to start flowing back into the program. And I think back to last season, to your point on Arkansas, and I just remember the way the season ended, the Auburn game and the Missouri game. And then of course, but sort of before that, there was the announcement that Sam Pittman was kind of coming back, and you kind of go, okay, on one hand that makes sense, but you saw the sort of the way that Arkansas fans seem out on Pittman, and maybe you thought there would be a change. But I think just in general, kind of goes to your point, excitement, optimism generates donations, which makes it easier to get players in this era. And I think that is something that Clark Lee at Vanderbilt, given how difficult it already is going to be fighting even more if they go 2-10 or 3-9.
I think Clark Lee's at my door. He's mad I'm talking hot seat, so I better stop that. But again, what I'll be excited about Vanderbilt, you hit on Diego Pavia already, but I put it as the New Mexico State influence, Steve, with Diego Pavia, with offensive coordinator Tim Beck, with, I don't even know what his official title is, Jerry Kill. I'm calling his head coach analyst here. That's I guess technically what he is. But how does that influence Vanderbilt? And maybe does it give him something a little bit different? Because quite frankly, you have to be different at Vanderbilt to have success. And I don't know a ton about New Mexico State, but I would venture to say it's the same in their league. There's not a bunch of 5 stars, 4 stars going to New Mexico State unless you're in the EA Sports video game. You got nothing to work with, so you got to get creative, and that's what they were able to do. They won big there. Can they translate that? They're not going to win 10 games at Vanderbilt like I believe they did at New Mexico State, but they can be a difference in taking a program that seems quite frankly, it seems pathetic right now to just being a difficult out to pulling an upset here or there. And I certainly hope they do it because I'm tired of calling Vanderbilt essentially a bye, but that's what they are in conference play right now.
I hate to go on the road of New Mexico State because I know we're going to talk SEC here, but I think you bring up a good point about Tim Beck and Jerry Kill. They did win 10 games last year. New Mexico State's one of the hardest jobs in college football. Like, New Mexico just doesn't produce a ton of talent. It's also sort of an outpost, and they sort of bounced around from independent whack, the Sun Belt Conference USA. So I think if you're a Vanderbilt fan, what should give you some optimism is these guys have experience at getting the most out of the roster, and a lot of their roster was sort of transfers, JUCOs, kind of bounce backs. I think that if I'm Vanderbilt, I'm looking at this going, we got a quarterback that's been in this system already. You got a play caller that's been a successful. Tim Beck was at Pittsburgh State, I believe, and had a great tenure there. Jerry Kill throughout his career has done a good job of maximizing rosters. That's kind of what Vanderbilt's got to do. Like, they got to be creative and they got to maximize talent, and sort of that foundation that New Mexico State coaching staff with shadow head coach Jerry Kill and Tim Beck. I mean, that's probably about as good as they can do given the situation that Clark Lee finds himself in this year.
And early comment of the night, Michael Specs. If they can schedule Hugh Freeze, maybe that would help too. So, yeah, that'd be great. But all right, moving on here. We got again. Hit us with a donation if you want your team thrown to the top of the list. Until then, let's go with Texas A&M. Stephen, new era, Mike Elko. What's the biggest thing going into camp that you'll be looking for from the Aggies?
Offensive line. I think number one, keeping Connor Wigman healthy is the biggest priority, because I think when you look at this potential for this team, the big games are at home. They have an opportunity to surprise some people this year. I think Mike Elko is going to do a better job at maximizing the talent that's on the roster that Jimbo Fisher couldn't do. But I think for this offense to really take off under Colin Klein, it goes back to the offensive line. And they've had talent there. They've underachieved. I think Steve Adazio was a pretty poor offensive line coach. I think Adam Cushing and Colin Klein, that pairing is going to be a lot better. And I think when you look at the personnel and kind of see, Trey Zune, could be kind of a guy who contends for all SEC honors. Chase Besantis, really solid freshman year last year, could take that step forward. What do they get out of Reuben Fatherly coming back from injury? The transfers, like, there's a lot of interesting pieces there for A&M, and the whole offense could really take off if that group is able to mesh in the spring, protect Connor Wigman, and also get a little bit more production from those running backs, clear some running lanes. Reuben Owens and all those guys, really solid, I think, group of running backs for A&M. Line of scrimmage league, A&M's kind of lagged there the last couple of years. If this group takes off, all of a sudden the sleeper kind of playoff talk could really ramp up for A&M if they beat Notre Dame in the season opener.
Yeah, and again, I hate to keep talking about the video game, Stephen, but it's kind of taken over my life here when I'm not working. But I have come to appreciate. I run Texas A&M's offense, and obviously that's Colin Klein's offense. I didn't realize how much running, how much option and things of that nature is in that playbook. But I think that will suit A&M well. To your point, if they can get the offensive line in order, because based on what we're hearing, they have a three-headed monster at running back, and they may not be exactly where they want to be at receiver, which I think they have some really good receivers, but maybe not exactly where they want to be right now. So I think they're going to lean on that ground game. It's going to be a lot different than what it was looking under Jimbo Fisher, a modern offense. So I don't know. Again, just playing with that offensive system, it's making me more intrigued about Texas A&M this fall.
I think that also this gets at the other thing of when you mentioned the receivers for A&M, Moose Muhammad, Noah Thomas, a healthy Donovan Green at tight end, but also, there's some optimism from Mike Elko about Jabari Barber, the transfer from Troy, about his recovery from an offseason injury and getting back to 100% by the time they get early in the season. But just in general, I mean, there's sort of it's almost like a cliche to say this, but like a physicality sort of Mike Elko going to impose his will on this roster. And you've sort of seen that sort of take place where they're not going to talk about the kind of winning the SEC. They're just going to do the work. And that was kind of a theme that you picked up on from Mike Elko at SEC Media Days. One way you do that is you get back to being physical. You get back to being nasty in the trenches. And if you can do that, that sort of opens up all this promising, I think, pieces and offensive scheme that Colin Klein has for Texas A&M.
Yeah. Hey, we got a commenter here says SEC Mike sits down to pee. How did he know? All right. Oh, I'm sorry. All right. How about this
You
one?
better check your bathroom for cameras.
Oh, wait. I didn't even give mine. My bad. Texas A&M. How about this, Stephen? Again, great points made by you. But what about defensive backs? That's kind of
Yep.
where I'm going. And I don't know if you caught our interview with Billy Lucci at SEC Media Days. Go back and check it out, anybody, if you missed it. But he said something to us, Stephen, that I mean, it like froze my brain for a moment. I didn't realize it. But A&M, since they've come into the SEC, they've had one corner drafted in the NFL. And that's wild when you think of a high-level SEC program. And I know people mock, I don't get it, people mock Texas A&M since they've come into the league. They're the fifth most winningest program in the nation's toughest conference. So they're right there. But you would think they would have a lot more production on that side of the ball. Can they get that corrected? They got a lot of transfers. Des Ricks, Will Lee, Jaden Hill, Trey Jones, BJ Mays, and Tyreek Chappelle and Bryce Anderson are outstanding players. So can they put these pieces together and have a really good secondary? That's one of the things that I picked up watching, what little Duke football I have watched, but I kind of have watched a little bit more this offseason after they hired Mike Elko. It seemed like the secondary really overperformed the talent that he had to work with. Can we get back to that this fall? And can he put those pieces together to make a cohesive unit? I think that's going to tell the tale of Texas A&M's defense this fall.
Absolutely. And I think to your point, one of the things about Duke's defense was they had, before Mike Elko got there, they had a lot of experience, and he sort of translated that into production, and some of those guys sort of reached their potential over their junior and senior years. So I think you could see that sort of playing out at Texas A&M. And some of those transfers that you mentioned, I mean, I think I count, 7 defensive backs transferring in. I mean, guys like Des Ricks, also Will Lee at Kansas State was a starter. Like, those guys could come in and upgrade this secondary right away. And also, if the secondary is better, you look away, this front could really shape out for A&M. Scorton coming off the edge, Shamar Turner, Shamar Stewart, some of the other guys that they still have in the program. Some of the depth may not be there 100% like last year. But they're going to have no trouble getting to the quarterback. So if they can hold up on the back end, and Mike Elko kind of does what he did at Duke with the defense and transforming it, this is going to be a really formidable group in SEC play.
Yeah, no doubt. And hey, shout out Cousin Rick, always eager to throw us a donation. Really appreciate you, Cousin Rick. He says, time to watch the return of the wrecking crew down there in College Station. Can't wait for it, Rick. Notre Dame right out the gate. Win that one. Hey, how about this, Steve? Because he gave us $20. I want to throw this at you real quick. Cousin Shane and I were talking about this on the last episode. Just want to hear your thoughts, because we know you're more knowledgeable than Shane and I put together. But let's say Notre Dame is legit. Let's say they are a top 10-ish type team. If Texas A&M can beat Notre Dame in the opener, again, I'm saying if Notre Dame is a really good team, if they can beat Notre Dame, who else could possibly beat them on this schedule? I mean, the only ones that I'm seeing, Texas perhaps, Missouri if they live up to the hype, and maybe LSU. And I don't think LSU is going to be quite as what other people are cracked up to be. But do you get what I'm saying here? If this team is capable of beating a top 10-ish type team at home, who's good enough to beat this Aggie team?
I agree with you. Mike, I think it kind of gets at what you and I have been talking about this offseason with Texas A&M. The schedule is pretty favorable. I mean, for a first-year coach, and the fact that A&M has underachieved in recent years, you have a head coach in Mike Elko who I think would probably going to get way more out of the roster, and all those tough games are at home. So if you beat Notre Dame, which I think is going to be somewhere in the top 10 to 12 when the Associated Press poll comes out this preseason, I mean, LSU, Missouri, they both at home. They're going to be right in the same range that's ranked. I think Texas out of those is probably going to end up finishing the highest, and will certainly be ranked higher in the preseason. But if you're getting them at home, and that's the return of that rivalry game, College Station is going to be crazy on November 30th. So that schedule is really favorable for A&M. The only thing that would worry me is those road games like South Carolina, like Auburn, like a Mississippi State, somewhere in SEC play. It feels like maybe it's Florida. They could stumble once kind of as a surprise loss.
Mm-hmm. And wouldn't it just be the way college football works, Stephen? They've owned Arkansas in Arlington Final year they hold that game, Arkansas gets a win. I mean, that's
Yeah.
just the way college football
That's
works, isn't it?
that's perfect. As a perfect way to sum up college football, Texas A&M could beat Notre Dame, LSU, Missouri, Texas, and lose to Arkansas.
Hey, shout out cousin Brandon. He says, "Howdy, toddy." He's a big Ole Miss guy who's frequently donates to the show, so we appreciate you, cousin Brandon. So let's do Ole Miss next, Stephen. Biggest thing you're looking for heading into fall camp, and what could be a historically great year down there in Oxford.
Mike, I'm on board with historically great because I think this Ole Miss team is primed for a deep run in the college football playoff. I think what interests me the most probably won't surprise you, and that's going to be the defense. And I think what I'm going to be looking for, we can't read everything into scrimmage results and scrimmage stats, but I'm curious, like when Lane Kiffin gets into the fall camp, and what is he saying about the defense? What is the spring kind of scrimmage, the fall scrimmage is bearing out? Like, is there real progress on this side of the ball? Because when you look at, we talked at the beginning about the personnel, like all your transfers, all your freshmen, they're in place. I don't have many concerns about this offense. Certainly, Quinshad Judkins is going to be missed, but the Walter Nolan, the Princeleys, Chris Paul, all of those pickups, this is kind of where you would expect to see this defense start to kick it up a notch as you go into game one. So I've got my eye on defense, and I'm watching close to see what Lane Kiffin and Pete Golding are saying about this group when fall practice starts up.
Right, that's exactly where I went as well, Stephen. Year two, Pete Golding's defense. You'd like to see a bigger impact. Not that they were awful last year, but still, huge area of concern. The games that they did drop, in large part to offense. Although I guess you could say Georgia really flattened their scheme on offense as well. But given who they're playing, all the playoff talk is legitimate. All the national championship is legitimate. If they can field a capable defense, that's the whole key to the whole thing. While we're all excited about Jackson Dart and all these weapons that they have to work with, may have the best offense in the country, it's not going to matter if their defense is horrible again. Now, could they win 10 games with a horrible defense? They've done it before, and horrible is probably that's too mean. But just a bottom tier SEC defense, sure. Can they win in the playoff? Can they even make the playoff with a below average defense? I don't know that they can. So your goal should be to win and win at an incredibly high level, but it's only going to happen as much praise as and hype we're getting Kiffin and all these offensive stars. It's only going to happen if a defense can make some stops, force some turnovers, and really take that big jump in year two under Pete Golding.
You're also paying for this defense to be a lot better. Not only it's Pete Golding, it's also everything you've done in the collectives and NIL. Last year, in 4 games against ranked opponents, Ole Miss gave up about 38 points a game. Now, some of that, of course, was Georgia. Some of that was the high-scoring game against LSU. But still, I think that's the number this season that's got to be lower. Like when you play, obviously we know what happened after the loss to Georgia last year. Kiffin came out and said, hey, we got to get more talent. Well, this year against Georgia, can this group keep it closer? LSU, Oklahoma, the schedule's really favorable here for Ole Miss, but the expectation is you're going to score a ton of points, no doubt about it. But I think for the Ole Miss, the jump that we're all expecting for them to make a run in the playoff, it has to come on the back of an improved defense. And I think based upon what they went out and got this year in the transfer portal, it should show in the stat sheet this season.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, how about this one from our buddy J Rod, Hot Rod out there? It was said today that 11 players on Arkansas's team are running 22 miles per hour. What are you looking for in them hogs? And real quick, let me give them a thanks, Gus. So appreciate you, J Rod. Let's do Arkansas next, Stephen. What's your biggest thing for the Razorbacks heading into camp?
There was a comment by Sam Pittman that I guess you can take coach speak for what it is, but at SEC Media Days, he seemed pretty optimistic about the offensive line. And I'm looking at this group going, this group's probably going to make or break the season. I think Taylon Green and Bobby Petrino and Jaquindon Jackson, the transfers and the new coaching hires, they're going to work out just fine offensively for this Arkansas team. But we saw this last year, and it's true this year. This group won't take off unless the offensive line is a lot better. They've got 3 transfers at left tackle, center, right tackle, arguably your most 3 important positions. How does this group come together? I trust Sam Pittman to sort of figure this out because he's such a great offensive line coach. But this group holds the key to the season for me. If that group is better, I really think Arkansas's got the offensive firepower to make a run at a bowl game, which in turn would save Sam Pittman's job. So really, it all comes back to the offensive line for me.
Right. And if you're just listening to this back later, Arkansas last year, yards per rush, 106 in the country. That's pitiful. Explosive rushing, 97th in the country. So, yeah, to Steven's point, that's exactly where I was going as well. Offensive line for the Razorbacks, because all indications, Steven, Taylon Green is going to be a really solid player. New offensive line coach Eric Mateos, I think that'll help. They have changed offensive line coaches. Talked to who was it? I think John Neighbors at SEC Media Days, and he just said, based on everything he's hearing, just the previous offensive line coach just wasn't ready. And Eric Mateos, he's been at Baylor. He's worked under Sam Pittman. Baylor won some big-time games the last couple of years. He was the offensive line coach for 3 years. So you're hoping that not only that, but Sam Pittman also working extensively with the offensive line throughout spring and hopefully into fall camp, that we can get this lineup with you, as you noted, with all these transfers coming in, with some players that, quite frankly, were pretty good. Like Josh Braun last year was an excellent offensive lineman for the Razorbacks. But we all know in the offensive line, you could have 4 outstanding offensive linemen. You got one breaking that chain, it's going to get exposed. So can they get it together? I believe number 1 in the SEC in returning receiving production. Yeah, Arkansas 93% there. Again, if we get the offensive line together, I firmly believe we've got the quarterback in Bobby Petrino's system. And it sounds like they want to go back to more smash mouth, Stephen. They're going to feature a fullback. My goodness, remember when we used to have fullbacks all across the SEC? Now you have one. It's an exotic position that, quite frankly, I don't know that every program in this conference even has a fullback on the roster. You know what?
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I was reminded our good friend Marcus Satterfield at South Carolina, now he's at Nebraska, had mentioned something last year at Nebraska, like they were going to use a fullback, they were going to huddle, and I was like, what are these like artifacts they're breaking out? I mean, it's like a playbook from the 1970s that's coming back. But no, in all seriousness, Arkansas averaged 3 yards per carry in SEC games last year. That's got to change. I mean, the previous year they were over 4. Like I said, I really like Jaquindon Jackson. He was a guy that could have been an All-American at Utah, got a little bit banged up last season. Also, I think Taylon Green's mobility and all this, escaping the rush, not only that, sort of maybe it covers for some of those flaws on the offensive line, but also when plays break down, his arm strength to push it downfield, and those kind of plays that are when they break down could be a real asset for this Arkansas team. So I'm a little bit more optimistic about this Arkansas offense coming together if the offensive line looks good early in the season.
I'm sorry, Steven. I blacked out when you said Marcus Satterfield. Is he still the offensive coordinator at Nebraska?
Yes.
Wow.
I would say he may hold the title. They hired someone else this offseason. There's a little bit of gray area there on who's going to be the play caller, but yes, he still holds that title.
No wonder Matt Rule thought, hey, this league is just so tough, so dynamic. We deserve, a quarter of the playoff spots. He didn't realize, just how difficult it was when you got Marcus Satterfield calling the plays. That's why the Big 12, Big 10, whatever the heck it's called, looks tough to him, is because he's got a moron as an offensive coordinator.
It's He willingly hired Marcus Satterfield as his offensive coordinator. I should tell you something.
All right, how about this one from Chris Brown? I don't think he's a Georgia fan, but he did say who he's a fan from. Georgia is giving away free handcuffs for every jersey purchase. So low blow, but hey, us that are getting our heads pounded in by Georgia, we don't have much trash to talk, so we're going to trash them how we can. Let's do Georgia next, Stephen. What is the biggest thing going into fall camp? And I wouldn't imagine you're looking at the arrest records, but that could be it too if you want.
Well, I think we should kind of start there and kind of wonder what the status of like Ra Thomas is going to be. Early in the season, they get Clemson in the opener. It also sort of begs the question, if you're Georgia, like what are you going to get out of London Humphreys and Colby Young, your 2 transfers early on in the year? I think that is an interesting storyline, but that's not where I went with here for Georgia. I'm going to go to the other side of the ball, and I'm going to go with defense. And certainly this defense was just fine for Georgia last year. It just was not at the level that we saw in 2022. And you start looking at that defensive front, and certainly there's a lot of experience coming back, a lot of talent. This group should be really good once again. But I'm wondering, out of fall practice, are they going to be able to take this up a notch and get back to that level that we saw in 2022? And Jordan Hall already banged up a little bit, may miss some time in fall practice. There's a little bit of, I think, uncertainty of how this group's going to shake out. Also, Michael Williams, like, where does Georgia sort of settle on him as a player? Like, he's a defensive playmaker. Is he an edge? Is he going to play end? Like, where does he fit in? Because his pass rush ability, Georgia could use a little bit more havoc, I think, at the line of scrimmage. So I'm interested to see, what does Kirby think about the defensive front? Do we have some new faces that emerge maybe in fall practice? That's kind of my area of intrigue for Georgia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good one, Stephen. But I went with, speaking of Ra Thomas, that was going to play it. I didn't do this on purpose, but replacing Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey, who Georgia fans certainly know how valuable Ladd McConkey has been. But I think the rest of the SEC probably underestimating just his impact and the fact, what was he, was he a second round pick? I mean, he was a high round pick in the NFL draft. That just goes to show what NFL evaluators think of Ladd there and the impact he made at Georgia. And it goes without saying, Brock Bowers, I think he may have been the most dynamic athlete in college football the last couple of years. So how do you replace those guys? There's no shortage of weapons, but if Ra Thomas is not available now, all of a sudden, we do got Dominic Lovett, of course, who he's got massive potential. I think Dylan Bell is that guy that could possibly be the next superstar offensive weapon for Georgia. And Trevor Etienne, I know he's a running back, but have to believe they'll use him in some pass catching situations. So again, they've got the guys, but they don't got another Brock Bowers. And quite frankly, they may not have another Ladd McConkey too. So what happens with this difficult schedule, Stephen? They get into a crucial third down. Who do they go to? On the road at Alabama, maybe even against Clemson in the opener, at Texas, at Ole Miss, versus Tennessee. They need someone they can consistently step up in crucial situations. And they may have that guy, but they may not have that answer today.
I think Auburn on the road, 2023, Carson Beck coming of age because he's throwing to Brock Bowers to some extent. I think that kind of shows how important he is. And when you look at Georgia's schedule, the opener against Clemson, I think if Georgia's offense doesn't fire on all cylinders in the opener, I think they're going to be okay in that one. But I've got my eye focused on September 28th, going to Tuscaloosa. Certainly Alabama's got a lot of new faces in the secondary, but to your point, this receiving core kind of in flux here. Like by then I would assume there's some sort of kind of finality on Thomas's status by September 28th. But in general, I'm looking kind of at Georgia's depth chart too. And I think one guy that kind of flew under the radar for Georgia is Ben Urasek, the tight end from Stanford. He was hurt last year, and Stanford's offense at times was, was kind of a prehistoric offense because they just kind of used like cavemen and like beat on people under David Shaw. I think he's going to be a real weapon for Georgia. And you throw in Oscar Delp, I think they've got two solid options. I think to your point, Mike, do they have a go-to guy? And I think that's what we're going to find out in that opener against Clemson. And we may also find out in fall practice, like how does London Humphreys and Colby Young look too?
Mm-hmm. Well, all right, Stephen. So marching on again, we're going in reverse alphabetical. So I may screw this up. I'm not very good at letters and numbers and things of that nature. But throw us a donation. Let us know your team, and we'll move them to the top of the list. But how about Texas, Stephen? Where are you going for the Longhorns? First SEC season, of course. What is the biggest storyline you'll be watching for Texas?
I can't wait to the first scrimmage where Arch Manning throws like 4 touchdowns and the Ewers Arch Manning quarterback battle starts again. I'm just kidding. I think I think if you're looking at fall practice for Texas, it's really about the defense. And, I'm kind of on the fence. I can't really decide which one to go with here, so I'll just kind of package them both. It's the line in the secondary. I'm fascinated to see what they get out of Javion Cole, a San Jose State transfer. You also throw in Malik Muhammad, who I think is going to be a breakout star for Texas this year. So maybe it is kind of that cornerback role for Texas because we saw them give up some yards last year. They do have some questions about replacing Murphy and Sweat. I'm kind of bouncing all over the place, but at the same time, I'll kind of think line and secondary is kind of tied T1 for most important storyline for me for Texas.
Yeah, no, that's a solid one, Stephen. But I'm going. This has just struck me ever since I did all this data. Receiving yards returning, dead last in the SEC is them Texas Longhorns. And I know they added Matthew Golden from Houston, Isaiah Bond from Bama, Silas Bolden, Oregon State, and Amari Niblack also from Alabama. But I love to say this, and it's very true, and nobody seems to catch it, but this ain't a video game. As much as we love the video game, you can't just plug these guys in and there's no drop off. And again, even guys like Amari Niblack and Isaiah Bond, who were recruited by Sarkisian, may have even played for Sarkisian for a year. Again, it's just not quite the same. Now, will those players be fine come November? Perhaps. But again, there's a lot of tests before the end of the season, Steve. I mean, Oklahoma will get you. Georgia can get you. I literally, people think I'm crazy, but I think the entire month of November is losable if you don't show up and you don't play good games against Florida, Arkansas, Kentucky, and at A&M. These are some very, very difficult games. And again, Quinn Ewers has been inconsistent. He's massively talented. This is not a knock on him, but he has been inconsistent. When you have an inconsistent quarterback working with an entire new receiving core, I don't think Texas is just going to light up the scoreboard, at least not right out the gate. I think this is a big storyline that very few people seem to be focusing on.
Let's go to week 2. How about the matchup at Michigan? Michigan's defense, Will Johnson, I think, might end up being the best corner in college football this year. I know Travis Hunter at Colorado, and there's a few others that are in the mix, but Will Johnson's pretty much a lockdown guy for the Wolverines. Also, Michigan's defensive front's pretty good. So if you're Texas, yes, Michigan has big-time question marks on offense, and scoring points might be a challenge, but what if this Wolverines defensive line takes control and you're still trying to mesh Ewers and these receivers against a good Michigan secondary? Week 2, all of a sudden, could get pretty interesting for Texas. I think this receiving core is extremely talented. And all the transfers that you mentioned, throw in Ryan Wingo, the true freshman, they've got a lot of weapons here. I think for me, it's about how fast does this group come together? Because if they do, and I think you're kind of at the point of, this is Ewers' 3rd season as the starter. He needs to stay healthy. He's going to get opportunities each week in the SEC for high-profile competition that could boost his draft stock. And you would expect by now, as a 3rd-year starter, he makes that jump. So I think that's there's some interesting sort of storylines surrounding this Texas offense. In time, I think they're going to be clicking on all cylinders, but I'm really interested to see how that receiving core shakes out early.
Mm-hmm. All right, so hey, we're moving on again, reverse alphabetical here until we get a donation. But how about Tennessee, Stephen? I have a feeling, because you've been talking about it all off season, I think I know where you're going, but where you go with the Vols?
Yeah, no misdirection here, Mike. You know exactly where I'm going. We're asking about the primary, question. It's the secondary here for Tennessee. I think just a lot of intrigue for me of the personnel turnover. It's a group that has struggled the last couple of years. I'm also looking at Tennessee's defensive line, which I think is one of the top 10 to 15 in college football. How does that kind of be compatible with a secondary that's got a ton of new faces, whether it's transfers, whether it's a freshman like Boo Carter, or someone else in the program like a Ricky Gibson who may be ready to step up. So I've got kind of my eye on seeing how throughout the fall Tennessee's Tim Banks, Josh Heupel, what are they saying about the secondary? Who do they think is stepping up? Who's kind of filling those starting roles? Because I think Tennessee is going to be a playoff contender, but that secondary is my primary concern for this team.
Yeah, no doubt. That's exactly where I went. That's why I was kidding with you, because I knew it. But basically out with the old, in with the new. And for whatever reason, never got him on the record, but why the Tennessee coaching staff was so stuck in their ways, so to speak, of just playing the veterans. I mean, they've refused to play younger guys. Well, now they have to, because everybody left. The secondary has killed them in some big-time matchups. And given the front 7 that Tennessee potentially could have this year, they don't need the best secondary in the SEC. They just need an improved secondary. And this could be one of the sneaky good defenses in the entire conference to go with this offense. But since you went with Cousin Shay says my biggest question is how expensive do you think the national championship tickets will be? But since you went with the same thing, I don't want to just repeat one thing, and I don't think we'll get this in camp necessarily, but something we really need to see in a season that was completely missing from Tennessee's offense, Stephen, after that explosive 2022 was the explosive plays. They were just gone last year, and we can blame whoever we want to blame on that, but it was running and it was dink and dunk. That was the offense last year. Yeah, I know you've said it many times. It was literally the worst offense statistically that Josh Heupel has put on the field as a head coach, yet they won 9 games. So can we get back? They don't have to, go deep every play or anything like that, but we just need to not be in the, I think they were like in the hundreds of explosive plays after being number 1 in the country in 2022. Let's split that difference. Get near the top 25 in explosive plays with a really good running game and an improving defense, and Tennessee's in the college football playoff.
To give you an idea, Mike, Tennessee led the SEC in plays of 30-plus yards in 2022. They had 53. Alabama had 38. That was second place. So they were gapping Alabama significantly. They had 29 all of last year. So, I mean, there is definitely, when you look at the stat sheet, kind of like you mentioned, Mike, I mean, the fact that Tennessee did as well as it did with that, I don't know if anemic, all things considered under Josh Heupel is the right word, but if they won 9 games given that offense, and this year it could get back to like 2022 level potentially, I mean, that's why I think Tennessee's schedule and early in the season when they play Oklahoma and NC State, Grayson McCall, Jackson Arnold, the playmakers for both of those teams will test Tennessee right away. If Tennessee wins both of those games, I mean, I'm looking at October 12th and October 19th. Don't want to overlook the trip to Arkansas because that could be a trap game. But man, Tennessee's schedule really breaks in their favor. And if that secondary is better and they don't give up big plays and the offense is clicking, this could be a really, I don't want to say feels like 98 for Tennessee, but it could be a pretty special season as they go to the college football playoff.
You just made Cousin Shane's night. Thank you, Stephen, with that one. But hey, we just had here we go. Cousin Jared, appreciate you. $10 donation. He's a big LSU guy, Stephen. So how about LSU? What is your biggest question for them Tigers?
I think it'll be no surprise, Mike, but I'm interested in sort of what is the buzz out of fall practice on the defensive side of the ball. And I think there's certainly sort of a kind of baseline that I expect, Blake Baker to get this defense. Like there's just too much talent for LSU to be, 13th, 14th in the SEC in defensive categories. They should at least be kind of closer to middle of the pack. So I'm interested to see during this fall, like what is Brian Kelly saying? What is Blake Baker? How is the starting lineup shaping up? Because they've brought in some transfers, especially on the interior. We know that the secondary has been an issue. What's the buzz around Harold Perkins? Like everything looks good from the way that he's going to be deployed this year. But really, this defense, as bad as it was last year, like what's the level that LSU can get this group to? Because in week 1, they're going to play USC. Is going to be a test right out of the gate. And, we know the losses on the offensive side. So the defense is going to have to be better right away. And that's my biggest area of interest this season.
Right. And obviously you kind of have to go defense. So I tried to be a little bit more specific, and I'm going defensive interior and defensive line. And just given the fact, Stephen, that I don't know how much this really helps, but it couldn't hurt that they're going up against such a veteran, such a talented offensive line. I mean, they may not see a better offensive line than the one that they practice against every day. So it might be a little bit easier when they get to the games, believe it or not, even though they're playing in the SEC. So again, I'm going defensive interior. I just want to hear, because someone got it in our head on the last episode. They threw it to us this way, Stephen. They said, could LSU be leading the SEC in rushing after the first month of the season? And what they really wanted to know, if that happened, would my opinion of LSU change? And honestly, Stephen, I said no, because Southern Cal, we all know what a train wreck they are on defense. Nichols, I mean that's like a high school team. South Carolina does have a good defensive front, but I've heard you, and I just lean on you for UCLA knowledge. You said UCLA's not any good either, so it's not that far fetched to say LSU could be leading the SEC in rushing after the first month of the season, but you could just as easily flip it and say, well, we still don't know if they're that good. Are those fair comments based on this schedule?
100%, Mike. And throw in that game against South Alabama on September 28th, and then they have an off week after that. So we may not know a whole lot until October 12th when they play Ole Miss. I think they're, as we're kind of talking here, and I'm reminded of the defensive line. And I think Bo Davis is one of the best assistant coach hires this offseason. But also when you're looking at sort of a all SEC ballot for this year, I don't know that you're going to have any guys on the LSU side of things from the defensive line in the preseason discussion. Now, maybe somebody gets there by the end of the year, but that sort of kind of gets at what's interesting is this LSU team, like you could pretty much pencil in somebody on that defensive front, defensive line year over year for preseason all SEC honors. And there are questions there. And then I think you flip it around to the running back situation too, which, Mike, you've pointed this out. I mean, Jaden Daniels was the LSU rushing attack last season. And so like, who is going to be that guy? How are they going to manufacture the ground game? John Emery's banged up. You got Caleb Jackson, Trey Holly's has got some, legal concerns for this season. So there's a lot of, I think, interesting pieces to this team. I think looking at that schedule, what would worry me is, if they lead the SEC in rushing, I think there is a little bit, you have to look at it through the lens of that is a favorable slate. If they're at the bottom of the SEC and they're struggling to run the ball on USC, UCLA, and South Alabama, let's just say, I'd be really worried going into SEC play. So I would expect them to be productive against those teams for sure.
Right. But again, if I'm low on you, it probably means you're going to win a dang national championship here. So just put that out there. But all right, we're going in reverse alphabetical unless we get another donation. So let's go South Carolina, Stephen. I'm very curious to know where you go with the Gamecocks here.
One player. It's Lenora Sellers. I think I am just fascinated to see how his progression takes hold this year. Just such an interesting skill set, and also an offense that's got a questionable offensive line, albeit one that should be better. Rocket Sanders, I think, is going to be a massive upgrade at running back. How does Dowd Loggins build this offense around Sellers? And at some point in week 2, you're probably going to have to take the training wheels off because you're on the road against a good defense, and you're going to need some plays through the air to win. So I'm really fascinated by how fast Lenora Sellers develops for South Carolina this year.
Right. And I was laughing, Stephen, because I had two words written down here, and it's Lenora Sellers. So right on par with, I mean, my goodness, how good can he be? Remains to be seen, but they're going to need him, and they're going to need him to step up in a hurry. I have to imagine with what they're returning on the defensive side of the football, they'll be improved on that side. But again, they're going to be led by the defense, I would think, particularly early in the season. And they're going to have to steal some. A couple years ago, 2 years ago, Stephen, they were elite at forcing turnovers. They didn't quite get that last year, and that was a major, major difference in why they went to a bowl game and then why they didn't, in my opinion. So can they do that again against the likes of Kentucky and LSU, which Kentucky, Stephen, again, it's at Kentucky, but they have beaten Kentucky the last couple. We got a new quarterback, new offensive coordinator, new offensive line coach, even though it's, one that's been there before. But a lot of retooled pieces on the offensive side of the football. There's an opportunity South Carolina dominates, at least their defense, Kentucky's offense. So that is fair. And also LSU. I don't know if the kickoff time has been announced yet, but again, not totally reworked, but because they have the offensive line, but new quarterback, new receivers, new running backs. This could favor South Carolina's defense in that aspect as well. So can South Carolina come out here? They're not going to be outscoring people. I really don't think, at least not out the gate. So can Lenora Sellers make the plays when they need him to? the fact that he's mobile, you have to defend 11 on 11. I love that. We didn't have that last year. As good as Spencer Rattler was, he was not much of a threat to run the football. So, yeah, if Sellers is what some of these great Gamecock fans anticipate he will be, South Carolina could be one of the biggest surprises in the SEC. And I appreciate you, Jared. He says 11 a.m. kickoff for LSU, South Carolina. So advantage LSU. Sorry about that one. I was hoping for a night game for you, South Carolina, but you ain't getting it.
I think South Carolina's defense might be sneaky this year. I mean, I know they struggled at times early last year, but I like what they did in the portal. They sort of upgraded the front seven. They've got a lot of experience back in the secondary. One other thing I think that's of note for South Carolina, Xavier Legette led the team with 71 catches last year. The next wide receiver had 26. And they've brought in several transfers, I think guys that could really contribute right away, not to mention Nick Harbor stepping up this year. There's just a lot of unknown about this group. So I think how that starting receiving core rotation looks, and then, of course, week 2, we'll find out a lot. But I think South Carolina, like I said before, Mike, I think as the offseason goes along, I think I've gotten a little bit higher on this team, and it's largely because I think Sellers could be a real difference maker for him this year.
Mm-hmm. All right, how about Oklahoma, Stephen? Again, I think this is a little bit of an obvious one, but I'm gonna let you tackle it first.
Yeah, it's the offensive line. I was trying to be like sneaky and like throw something different out there, but yeah, I think just looking at the schedule for Oklahoma, and the Tulane game is in September is going to be interesting, but it's that Tennessee and Auburn stretch late in the month that has my attention, and it has my attention because by then we should have a really good idea of how this offensive line is coming together. So it's the story of Oklahoma's offseason. Everybody's talking about 5 new starters on the offensive line, but it just looking at the defenses they're going to play and the defensive lines combined with the weapons and the potential for Jackson Arnold, it's still, as much as we've talked about, it still dictates how the season goes for Oklahoma.
Stephen, I guess you don't know the name Bill Bedenbaugh, whatever. I've had to hear that a million times this offseason, but
he's the best.
He may be, Stephen, but he ain't on the field. You know what I mean? So that's the difference. Of course, they've added all these transfers. Branson Hicksman, Spencer Brown, Michael Tarquin. I'm going to butcher this. Fabici Nawawi, and Hatchett from Washington. I mean, these, from all accounts, are quality guys. So it's not like they're working with nothing, but thankfully, like you said, I mean, thankfully they have 2-3 weeks to get this unit gelled together after fall camp. So, I mean, that is a lot of reps working with this great offensive line coach. But that Tennessee game, I hate to repeat what you just said, but that offensive line versus Tennessee's defensive front, that is a major, major, major disadvantage in the Sooners' favor. Doesn't mean they can't win the game, but it could very well cost you the game. And as long as it doesn't, you could have one heck of a year. I truly think in Norman, if that offensive line by the 4th game of the season is where it needs to be.
Should also, I think, throw out the rushing attack for Oklahoma too, because both Barnes and Salchuk were banged up last season, but by the end of the year, Salchuk was kind of reeling off 100-yard efforts by the end of the year. So I think if you're Oklahoma, like, it's sort of have to work in tandem a little bit, kind of consistent ground game, take some of the pressure off Arnold. How does the offensive line hold up? I mean, poor Temple in week 1. I mean, one of the worst teams in college football with Oklahoma's offense looking to sort of figure things out before they get into SEC. That was going to be ugly for the Owls coming to Norman.
And I just love the comments, Steve. This is going to be the storyline of the whole season for me. They're basically saying Oklahoma is going to get exposed, and then, like Liquid says, Broklahoma's in for a rude awakening. And then Oklahoma fan says SEC mids in for a rude awakening. But this is why we're gonna love this year, because somebody's gonna be proven right, someone's gonna be proven way wrong, and I just can't wait, because I like when they're poking fun of each other in the comments. You know what?
Oh yeah, man! This season's gonna be so great. Just having Texas and Oklahoma and the rivalries back together, and how difficult these schedules are, and Missouri and Oklahoma, good friends getting back together too. This is perfect.
Great rivals, right? But speaking of that rivalry, how about Missouri? Where are you going for the Tigers, Stephen?
I hate to sound like a broken record when we talk about Missouri, but I don't think there are many questions about this offense. It seems weird to say that with Cody Schrader gone to the NFL, but my biggest area of interest is the defense, and I think it's for two reasons. Number one, Corey Batoon as a coordinator, I think a lot of skepticism. I think if he can match what Blake Baker did last year. So I think fall practice is the first sort of glimpse with all the transfers. How is this group coming together? And sort of the second piece to that is Missouri brought in a really quality class of transfers on defense. They are losing a lot, but this transfer class could keep this defense performing at a high level if Corey Batoon kind of puts his own stamp and continues what Blake Baker did. So I'm interested in schematics there. I'm also interested in seeing how the transfers kind of mesh with what Missouri brings back defensively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's right where I went as well. With a special highlight on the defensive backs. I know they bring back Carnell and Charleston and Norwood and Johnson, added Pride from Clemson. So again, they got good pieces, Stephen. But replacing 5 draft picks on the defensive side of the ball, including 2 corners, very few teams in this league, and really Georgia, Bama, and that may be the list, that can lose 5 guys to the draft on one side of the football and it not be a significant drop off. Now, maybe some other teams would, in a given year can do that, but can Missouri do that? That's what we're going to find out this fall about the Tigers. But to your point, they did add an excellent portal class. I believe it's around a top 15 class in the country. So again, no lack of effort to shore up those deficiencies, but thankfully, given their schedule, they're going to have a lot of time to kind of shore up. I mean, the first month is essentially a bye week,
Yeah.
all at home, thankfully, too. But, that could be a blessing and a curse, Stephen, because you could be going into that Texas A&M game on the road, and you may think concerns you had about your football team you have answers for, but they may get exposed because you've not really been tested the first month of the season. That's another way to kind of spin this.
Yeah, it is. And I think looking at their schedule, I think Boston College and Vanderbilt, if let's just say, like, what if Missouri's secondary struggles against Boston College and Vanderbilt? Boston College's quarterback is dynamic and Thomas Castellanos, and he can do a lot of things on the ground with his legs. Kind of like same thing like we talked about with Diego Pavia. But if you're Missouri and you struggle those 2 games, give up a lot of yards, that's probably not a good sign going into the game against Texas A&M. You could also look at it like this too. That schedule is so favorable that we probably won't know how good the defense is or sort of if they found the right pieces until October 5th. So that's kind of the unfortunate thing about the unbalanced schedules and non-conference games is we may not learn a lot until the second month of the season. And I think that's certainly true with maybe Missouri's defense. Is the A&M game might be very telling one way or the other.
Yep. Well, speaking of telling, Stephen, maybe that'll be what we get fall camp down at Stark. Well, what's the biggest thing for Mississippi State? So many unknowns, so many new pieces, new coaching staff, new everything. What are you focusing on, if you can focus on anything here?
Let's go with the offensive line. 5 new starters. They have some guys from the transfer portal that are expected to step in and play some snaps this year. I think so much from Mississippi State is going to rely heavily on the ability of Jeff Lebby, Blake Shapen, Kelly Akari, the new weapons, the new quarterback, the new staff and scheme. It's going to be so dependent on this group to get clicking early in the year, because that road trip to Arizona State, the game against Toledo, there's a couple tricky games early. If they can win those, get to 3-0 with Florida coming in on September 21st, you got a shot to maybe make a run at a bowl game. So I'm looking at settling the offensive line to give Blake Shapen time and help this offense take off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly where I went as well. Sorry to be so boring. But again, Mississippi State, I mentioned Cody Kennedy earlier, leaving Arkansas to come to Mississippi State. And now, again, they were not thrilled with the job he did there. But again, I thought he did a pretty good job when he was teamed with Kendall Browse. And Kendall Browse is the brother-in-law of Jeff Lebby. So certainly you got to believe that Cody Kennedy will mesh well with what Jeff Lebby's trying to do with all these new transfers coming in on the offensive line. And let's not overlook Albert Reese and Leon Bell as well, the returners that have played some snaps for Mississippi State on the offensive line. We all get enamored, Stephen, when we get a quarterback, when we get receivers, we get a running back. None of it matters if we don't have an offensive line. So I think that's got to be the number one prerogative for Jeff Lebby and company is to get the right five, get them comfortable, and if we have an offensive line, we can build the rest out, because with this offense, they're going to have success. It's made for success for the quarterback and the receivers, and quite frankly, they have a really good ground game. That's what they have at Ole Miss, Tennessee. That's what Lebby's had, and who comes from the Baylor tree, of course. It's always been great running backs, or at least high production running backs, to say the least. So if we get the offensive line going, we got us a shot this fall in Starkville. I really do think.
Yeah, and speaking of that run game, it may come down to how Davin Booth, the Utah State transfer, performs, because they lost some pieces, of course, with Woody Marks, and they've had some injuries here too. So I'm interested to see how the running back rotation shakes out. But Mike, speaking of that offensive line for Mississippi State, Texas, Georgia, Texas A&M, a 3-game stretch, we'll find out how good this offensive line or how far it has progressed, because that could be 3 of the nation's top 15 defensive lines right there in that 3-game stretch.
And not to mention Arkansas, who comes on the tail end of it. I think their defensive line is probably the best unit of their defense.
Agree. Yeah, I think not Landon Jackson, a couple other solid pieces coming back. I think a very underrated group for the Arkansas up front this year.
Mm-hmm. All right, Stephen, how about Kentucky? What's the biggest question for the Wildcats?
It is Brock Vandagriff. When I studied this team all offseason, I keep coming back to there's a lot to like about Kentucky. They've got a veteran offensive line. They've got a great trio of receivers, experienced defensive front. Deion Walker, Jamon Dumas-Johnson. They've got one of the best defensive lines and linebackers groups in the SEC. But for this team to, outperform preseason expectations, finish in the top 25, it's really dependent on how good Brock Vandagriff is. And you throw in Bush Hampton as offensive coordinator. Thought it was really interesting that Mark Stoops this week said it was sort of like the best combo of staff and roster that he's had in some time at Kentucky. So I think a lot of optimism, but also a lot of unknown here with Brock Vandagriff. I think he's just one of the bigger wild cards of the SEC.
Yeah, Brock Vandagriff is the answer, but I'm tying it also, Stephen, with new offensive coordinator Bush Hampton, how they mesh together. By all accounts, they want to run more tempo, which I think suits Brock Vandagriff's skill set. Moving away from the traditional pro style system, get him moving, mobile, play action, things of that nature, with a veteran offensive line and some nice receivers to work and tight ends to work with here in Lexington. If Brock Vandagriff can even scratch the surface of his massive talent, Kentucky's going to be just fine on the offensive side of the football. Now, if he's a bust, and I'm not saying he is, but if he's a bust, I think the whole season is going to be a bust, quite frankly. You know what?
Yeah, because the other options are Gavin Wimsatt, a transfer who struggled at Rutgers, or a true freshman. So it's really everything for Kentucky, and this year really goes into Brock Vandagriff being sort of, I don't want to say all SEC caliber, but certainly I think being a star at that position for Kentucky to hit its goals this year.
Yep. All right. How about what's your biggest thing for the Florida Gators, Stephen?
Defensive improvement, and I guess sort of a vibe check for Florida's defense coming out of the fall, because I think the depth of this defense with the transfers, the freshman class, it feels better. But we saw what the scheme and what Austin Armstrong put out in the field for year one. I think Ron Roberts being sort of the head coach of the defense will help a ton. And there's a lot of, production coming back this season. So I think if you're Florida, you have to hope that all those pieces, whether it's new transfers, whether it's freshmen, whether it's staff, all the new translates into improvement. So I think I'm looking for this fall, seeing how, if the vibes are good, what's Billy Napier think? Because I think that group is going to make or break Florida's season this year.
So it's not, which game does Billy Napier get fired?
It could.
I'm kidding. But no, I went right there with it. Defense, but I tried to be a little bit specific. The secondary, because they were just getting gashed by explosive plays time and time again. And a lot of those guys have left. Probably good news for Florida. You've added some key transfers, a new secondary coach, Will Harris. Corey Raymond. Again, he's done a heck of a job, and they're doing cartwheels. They got him back at LSU. Florida's doing cartwheels. He left. I mean, they were that bad. They were one of the worst secondaries in the SEC. Bringing in Asa Turner, Trickwez Bridges from Oregon, Jameer Grimsley, DJ Douglas. I mean, they're having to add pieces to shore up, and they've got some quality defensive backs on that roster, but can they just not get gashed? And was that even on the secondary? It may have been Austin Armstrong and his aggressive nature. If you don't get to the quarterback, you're leaving your back end exposed. Well, I don't think he's going to get at that. That's just his DNA. So he's not going to, if he doesn't go with what he knows. I don't know if he knows what his defense is, if it's not ultra aggressive. So maybe it's too complicated. I don't know. But we cannot be getting gashed here, because Miami, they got Cam Ward. He's an improviser. He will burn you. We got Connor Wigman here. He'll kill you if you let him. Who knows? Mississippi State with Blake Shapen, Nico. I mean, we're only halfway through the schedule, and I just named 4 quarterbacks. I overlooked KJ Jefferson,
Yeah.
Central Florida. I mean, time and time again, your secondary is going to get tested. If they're as pathetic as they were last year, you're toast. You're done. You should be getting your resume ready for your next job. The secondary has got to be better.
So 20 plays of 40-plus yards allowed by Florida's secondary last season. The next team up in the standings was LSU with 13. So they allowed 7 more plays of 40-plus yards than the next team up in the standings. And I think, Mike, to your point, like, Jason Marshall's got all the talent in the world to be a better, kind of all SEC kind of corner this year. And so it's kind of incumbent on Roberts and Armstrong to get the most out of this roster. Maybe the better question is, if they get off to that slow start, which I think you bring up a good point. I mean, Cam Ward, Connor Wigman, Mississippi State, UCF, Tennessee. Do they change play callers at some point? Does Ron Roberts take over the play calling if they struggle during that stretch? I mean, I don't think that's crazy to think, is it?
No, heck, he may have already done it, Stephen. Who knows? But how about this comment from Cousin Shade? Only question I have is, how much is a U-Haul rental down there in Gainesville? So, yeah, that's a good one. But, all right, hey, we're down to 2 teams here, Stephen. Auburn, what is your biggest thing for them Tigers?
Looking sort of another vibe check here. What's the passing game look like in fall practice? Because, we all off season, it's been, can Peyton Thorne take the next step? Well, we'll start to find out some evidence in the next couple of weeks, because the freshmen, the transfers, they're all there. Hugh Freeze has had some months to implement the offense. Everyone's on the same page. So I think I'm interested to see, once we get through the next couple of weeks and we have some scrimmages, what's the word about Auburn's passing game? How big of a factor is Cam Coleman going to be? I think a pretty big one. But let's see. Are we going to get any kind of highlight reel catches? I think we saw some of those. Could certainly happen based upon in the spring. Throw Keandre Lambert-Smith in. They'll get a good look at him. So passing game, that's where I'm focusing my attention on for Auburn.
Yeah, and you're too kind to just say Peyton Thorne, but that's where I'm going, because they're all chips on the table. Hugh Freeze, we ain't spending $1 million, so we're going to the dollar store. We got us a quarterback here, Steven, we can win with. Well, it's on Hugh now. It's on him to get it done. And the schedule, I mean, there's some breaks in it, no doubt, but that middle is a gauntlet. At Alabama's tough. A&M, I think you want, if you're going to be playing A&M, I think you want them early. I don't think you want them late when they have time to figure things out. So I think this is a underrated, difficult schedule for Auburn, and of course everybody knows what I think of Missouri. I think they can make the playoff as well. In fact, I think they will. You're having to go to Missouri as well. So, good news is, Stephen, you got a couple weeks to figure it out with new weapons to work with. Bad news is it ramps up in a hurry, and it doesn't. There's no break till early November.
Yeah, the schedule, the first sort of 3 weeks of the season, I think is going to be, I don't want to say deceiving, but California on September 7th, we remember sort of how offensively challenged that game was. It was not exactly the most well-played offensive game, 14-10. Auburn won out in Berkeley, and their defense this year has a lot of questions after not being very good. They seem to they seem to think that it's a good idea to pay Peter Sermon to call defensive plays. Why, I don't know. That's what California's doing on defense this year. But I think those first 3 games are, they're favorable for Arkansas, or for Auburn, but that Arkansas, Oklahoma, Georgia, Missouri stretch, like we'll find out sort of how far along this passing game is. Like that 3 games early in the year may be a little deceiving for Auburn. The real proof will come in SEC play.
Yep. All right, so last team here, Stephen, Alabama. What? And there's a lot you could focus on here. Where are you going with the Crimson Tide?
Kind of unusual, right? To have like this many directions you feel like you could go for Alabama. I went with the secondary because I think exiting spring, it was a question mark. And we saw what Alabama did in the transfer portal. They brought in Deshaun Jones from Wake Forest. They brought in Howard, the transfer from Charlotte. They also have the freshmen. A couple guys from that freshman class this year could play right away. So I think this fall will give us a better idea of the starting lineup, like which players are fighting their way into that starting position, to the rotation. But also, how does Kane Womack feel about this group? And not to mention, they lost Dallas Turner. They're going to have to replace some of the pass rush too. So if you can't get to the quarterback, your secondary could be exposed. I think kind of seeing what Kane Womack is saying and thinking about those 2 areas has my attention.
Right, and this is no slouch either, Stephen, with Alex Golish, offense week 2.
Yeah.
I believe Phil Longo is still at Wisconsin, so at week 3. And, of course, Georgia, Carson Beck, maybe the best quarterback in the country. That secondary is not going to get a ton, and I know you love to point out TJ Finley up there at Western Kentucky.
Right.
So they're going to be tested right out the gate. Not really, but
that's old SEC friend Tyson Helton is Western Kentucky's head coach too.
Oh baby, I forgot about. Yeah, so he is a quality offensive mind. So yeah, quite frankly, the first month of the season, Alabama will be tested in that secondary. That's exactly where I went. 10 players exited the program from the defensive backs just in one off season, which is pretty remarkable given that Nick Saban, that's what he was known for. That was his specialty, defensive backs. 10 of those guys left. Now, some of them went to the NFL, but a lot of transfers out. And, I know they kind of restocked with some transfers in as well, but these ain't Saban guys anymore. So, I don't know, Steve. We could go from the best of the best. Both their corners are now in the NFL to, I know they've got some guys back, but it could be a liability. And I'm not saying they will be, but certainly could be, particularly early in the season where there's not going to be much of a leeway like some of these schedules, like a Missouri or an Ole Miss, Oklahoma, Auburn, right out the gate. You get a couple weeks to kind of feel it out. There's not going to be much feeling out for Alabama secondary here.
Yeah, they're going to be under fire right away. I mean, I sort of joked about TJ Finley coming back, an old SEC friend, but Western Kentucky's got some good receivers. Like that's one of the better receiving cores in Conference USA. I'm not saying they're going to upset Alabama. I'm just saying like they could be stressed.
On the record, they beat them.
They could be stressed early in the season against some really good offenses, and I don't think it's crazy to think that Alabama could maybe start a freshman or a transfer at corner, which is just not what you're used to seeing. Like you're used to seeing Nick Saban just kind of turn over the roster and find guys year over year. I also have my eye too on the receiving core for Alabama because Ryan Williams is such an important recruit for Kalen DeBoer, and seeing if he can kind of crack the top 3 as a starter. Where does he fit in? You also have Jeremy Bernard, who comes over from Washington, very familiar with this offense. Those pass catchers with that much turnover, I think is going to be an area to watch early in the season too.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, Stephen, another great SEC After Dark. We'll be able to hit on all 16 SEC teams. Any closing thoughts as fall camp's getting underway? I know people need to go out and get their Athlon Sports magazine. Where can they get that, Stephen?
Absolutely. So you can get it at athlonsports.com. Our online store has all the covers available. So if you're an SEC fan living in Montana, you can order it there. We'll ship it to you. You can also check like Walmart, drugstores, Target, bookstores. That's the best place to get it on the newsstand.
All right, Stephen. Again, thank you so much for joining the show. I know you're fired up for football as much as I am, but man, we're running out of weeks here before we actually get here. It's going to be one heck of a season, and I just can't wait for it. You know what?
Same here, Mike. I mean, we're running out of SEC after dark, so I'm kind of sad. But at the same time, that means we'll get actual games, and we can make all kinds of assumptions real soon, like after week 1. So,
No doubt. Well, thanks again, my friend. Thank you to each and every one of you for hanging out. We'll catch you on the next one.